Good afternoon, and thank you for being here today. I'm Pamela Fox. I'm a professor in the English department at Georgetown. Elizabeth?
Yes, I'm Elizabeth Velez. I teach in Women and Gender Studies and in the English department. Technically, I'm retired, but I have come back to life and teach a course in the fall and the spring. So we are so happy to be here and to have Rachel with us.
Yes. So we'd first like to thank a couple of people. Patty Guzman, who is program manager of the Lannan Center for Poetics and Social Practice at Georgetown, particularly for her expertise in helping to organize this event, along with Karen Lautman, who is the administrator for the English department, and finally Lynn Dells, who is the director of communications for Georgetown College and is hosting this event. We also really deeply appreciate the sponsorship from the Lannan Center, from the English department, and last but not least, the Women's and Gender Studies program. As Elizabeth said, we are thrilled to bring Rachel Yoder back to the Georgetown campus to celebrate the success of her first novel, Nightbitch, which was published by Doubleday in 2021. This is very exciting. It's also been optioned for film, right? Is that true? Yes.
Really?
Okay, with Amy Adams. I don't know if she's still the person, right? But Amy Adams set to star as the protagonist. Do you have a sense of when that's?
Yeah, fingers crossed it'll start filming this fall.
Oh, excellent. Wow. So Rachel's a graduate of the Iowa Nonfiction Writing Program and also holds an MFA in fiction from the University of Arizona. Her writing has been awarded with the Editor's Prize in Fiction by the Missouri Review, and with notable distinctions in Best American Short Stories and Best American Non-Required Reading. She is also a founding editor of Draft, the Journal of Process. Rachel grew up, much like her protagonist, in a Mennonite community in the Appalachian foothills of Eastern Ohio. She now lives in Iowa City with her husband and son. We were just talking a little bit before this began, but I am personally just so delighted to reconnect with Rachel, who was just a wonderful student in my class fictions undergraduate course in 1999. So that was 23 years ago. And so it's just been great. I was reading her novel and, her name just kept coming up in my mind, thinking, Rachel Yoder. I had this fabulous student named Rachel Yoder. Could it be her, right? But then I was Googling and, we were talking about this before we started here, but it was just, so many Rachel Yoders out there. It was hard to find my Rachel Yoder. But I was very glad to find out that the author of this really tremendous book was also my student. So we're just delighted to have you.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
And,
go ahead.
No, I actually remember when Pam called me because I think we were reading Nightbitch at the same time. And she's like, you're not going to believe this. Rachel Yoder in my class, whatever, many years ago. So I also think for our students, it's such a delight to see somebody who went to Georgetown and who wanted to be a writer and who has turned out to be just an amazing writer. And the fact, so Pam and I have been teaching this class called Reading Motherhood for maybe 12 or 14 years. We teach it every other semester in the spring. We also have a website called Reading Motherhood. You can go to readingmotherhood.com. We did an interview with Rachel earlier this year, I think in October. So we would love for you to go back and look at that because we were able to email some questions that are probably more in depth than we'll be able to talk about today. We were bowled over by the novel, both of us. Lots of phone conversations, like we just couldn't believe this. The novel presents motherhood, which is very different from a lot of what the motherhood novels that are out there now, as an inherently feral experience. A woman artist and mother who finds herself being transformed into a dog. Um, and it's astounding when you're reading it in the beginning. You're like, no, this can't be, this is her mind. But the unnamed narrator is contending with both motherhood as a patriarchal institution and day-to-day mothering of her young son. And it's the day-to-day mothering that I think is so beautifully described to any of us who have ever done day-to-day mothering of small children. Um, the the experience, and it's one of the things we love most about the book. It is sometimes joyful, and it is sometimes more exhausting than anything else in the world, I think, sometimes. And I know there was an interview with you where you said, I refuse to write another narrative about a woman's self destruction. We need shape shifting, magic narratives of transformation. And I'd like to quickly read just an excerpt from a review in the New Yorker of the novel. But I think one of the things to just be aware of is that word transformation. So this is from the New Yorker's review of Nightbitch. The two predominant strains of maternal commentary in the 21st century can be summarized as mothers cannot possibly do all that is asked of them, and mothers are capable of anything. Each affirms the other. Mothers simultaneously cannot live up to both maxims, and they have little choice but to try. And round the mommy psyche goes. Yoder believes both and neither, and her novel happily occupies a floating realm between them. Nightbitch's embrace of her new life as a werewolf light explodes with joy. Any dash of Kafka in here is squashed by the sensual pleasure she takes in her new form. She likes the idea of being a dog as opposed to being a cockroach. I hated them. She had that freedom when she gave birth, had screamed and shat and sworn, and would have killed had she needed to. That's a quote from the novel. Women in fiction have worried for centuries that they're morphing into beasts beyond their control. But Nightbitch is jubilant. She loved being her body, loved being a body, and loved the boy, another body, she had made. As I read, I kept thinking of the unbelievable promises of orgasmic birth, that pleasure might rise free of pain. So let's turn to Rachel for her own introductory comments and then a reading from the novel.
Wow, Professor Velez, Professor Fox, thank you so much. As I said when we were talking before, it is a particular delight to be invited back to my alma mater, to Georgetown, to share with the community and to share with a professor whose class I loved and felt seen in so many years ago. I too would like to thank the English department and the Lannan Center, everyone who made this possible. So yeah, I would also like to thank, it should be noted, the reviewer who wrote that New Yorker review. Her name's Hillary Kelly, and she was pregnant with her second child when she wrote it. And so I really thought it was this serendipitous read that she gave the book, right? It like hit her right at the right moment. It was the middle of a pandemic. She was pregnant. And I am so grateful for that review, which I think just sees the book for exactly what it was aspiring to be. And I was just like so humbled by the clarity with which she was able to articulate what the book was doing, even beyond my own knowledge of what the book was doing. Yeah, so you beautifully introduced the book. As you said, it's a story about this one-time artist turned sort of ambivalent stay-at-home mom who becomes convinced she's turning into a dog. I had this idea for the book. Nightbitch came to me first in a joke. from my beloved husband who made the Nightbitch joke. And after, a little while, I thought, well, that's kind of a funny idea. What if I wrote a book where the mom actually turns into a dog? It struck me as a really bad idea, actually, and incredibly absurd, but there was something interesting at the center of it, and I didn't know what it was. And it was interesting enough and sort of funny enough to get me back into writing. I had not written for 2 years after the birth of my son, after an entire adulthood spent writing. And I was afraid I wasn't really a writer anymore. My personal crisis of motherhood very much parallels Nightbitch's crisis in the book. So this was a very personal undertaking at the outset. So I'll give you a little bit of background context for the book, for the little reading that I'm going to give, and I'll start in with that. So we have this mother who thinks she's turning into a dog. She gets a little patch of hair on her neck. Her canines start to sharpen, or so she thinks. She is at home all day, every day with her 3-year-old. She longs to return to her art, but she doesn't really see a way to make this happen, right? She doesn't have spousal support. Her husband is gone every week working. They're really strapped for money. This is very much also like a lower middle class. It's a class story too. And she can't seem to muster the positive thinking that she thinks will extricate her from this sort of sludge of domesticity. Nightbitch also has a bad attitude about the other mothers in town on the mommy circuit, is what she calls it. And these sort of power mommies have fully embraced their roles as wives and mothers in a way that makes Nightbitch really disdainful. The mommies are also part of an herbal supplement multi-marketing scheme, which comes into play in the plot. So I wrote this book because I needed a story that dramatized my own struggles with motherhood and showed me a way out of my own domestic sludge, because I didn't know how to write that story for myself. I was also interested in how the body might be a source of great wisdom. I was interested in the literal transformation of the mother from human to dog, and how this might spur an internal, even more magical transformation, and what that would look like. So in the scene I'm going to read, it comes about halfway through the book, and the mother is right on the edge of like her biggest breakdown of the book. She thinks that she's kind of on the upswing. She thinks like her marriage is kind of back on track. She's just going to forget about art. She's going to be a wife and a mother. She's going to choose happiness, and everything is going to be great. But then she goes out to dinner with her old grad school friends from art school, and they have not stepped out of their careers. They have been making art. And so this is where we find the mother in this scene that I'll read. And this reading should take about 10 minutes. It was just as things really seemed to be starting to come together, just as her son was now going to sleep on his own in the kennel. She gets a kennel for her son to go to sleep. Her sex life was reignited. She was making mommy friends. She was, dare she say, enjoying mommy life a bit more with her doggy games and not worrying about her career. It was just as her motherhood seemed to be coalescing that she took the liberty of actually going out on a weekend night with some old friends from grad school, the kind working mother she'd lunched with, and their old pal, the videographer. What a novelty, what a delight to join other accomplished women for a dinner cooked by someone else, and a glass of white wine and stimulating conversation, a chance to share their respective trials and tribulations within a context of mutual respect and admiration. The working mother who taught at the university started in about her work immediately, explaining even before they ordered that she had been confronting and complicating the notion of appropriation, artistic ownership, and public persona by recontextualizing Instagram posts within works of art. This woman, this working mother / working artist who had it all without a hitch, printed out Instagram posts in large scale, and that was it. That was the art. Oh, sure, there were claims of curation and the power of juxtaposition, but when it really came down to it, she had browsed Instagram and found some pics and gotten a large scale printer, and voila. Nightbitch had read about it on her website and then in the Times, where she saw that a recent piece had sold for $500,000. The other grad school friend, the videographer, had been experimenting with the interplay between seer and seen and the ways in which we mediate reality, as if that were a new thing, Nightbitch thought, as if there were actually any original thought that had even gone into such a project. This friend had just had a show in the Kelly Biennial featuring two literally unwatchable videos. In one, the video would cut in and out as the power surged and died, which was meant to inspire thought regarding our relationship with information and power, though Nightbitch felt the installation would simply be annoying. The other video, the videographer explained, was a real-time video of 24 hours of her day alongside an actress acting out that very same day in the very same space. Her friend said something about performance. Can we truly be ourselves while being watched? Blah, blah, blah. Nightbitch nodded and smiled. Sure, okay. And what are you working on? They asked her. And she stammered and chuckled, turned red, stared at the wall for a moment before saying something about the wildness of motherhood, the modern mother's impulse toward violence, the transformative powers of anger. Her friends squinted, then tilted their heads quizzically. I'm just at the concept phase right now, Nightbitch added, but I think it will ultimately be a performance piece. Oh, the working mother said, and then the videographer added, your work has always been so dramatic. And though Nightbitch wanted to say, at least I'm not doing some bullshit social media project that gives art a bad name, instead she nodded calmly and didn't say anything. It was meant to be a pleasant dinner, a reunion of sorts among grad school friends, one of whom she hadn't seen now in what, 8 years? It began nicely enough, how are yous and family updates, chats about this old friend or that one, but soon enough, Nightbitch saw exactly what was happening. You see, the old friends had been doing more work than she, gobs in fact. They had all been colleagues and friendly competitors neck and neck years ago back in school, even back just before her son was born. But since then, these friends had indeed moved forward, progressed in a reasonable and some might say even extraordinary fashion, given their talents and skills, whereas she had punched her artist card and checked into the stay-at-home mommy land. She hadn't wanted her baby to be with the horrible daycare women with rubber nipples all day. She had been desperate to hold him, to kiss his cheeks and smell his neck. And she hadn't wanted to cry as he nursed and then continue to cry some more as he fell asleep each night. She hadn't gotten to make him giggle and read his favorite books because he was so tired, exhausted by his day at daycare, where he refused to sleep. And she simply couldn't work at the gallery and do her own artwork and then take care of the baby by herself with her husband out of town. She couldn't, and so she had chosen the baby, the baby, the baby. His allure had been dreamlike and intoxicating and had left the rest behind. And now, these other women, they were her friends, had kids, but one had sold a piece of art for $500,000 and also had a live-in nanny, while the other had the ability not to care about the horrible women in the daycare, or at least not give into it, and instead had enlisted her child in full-time daycare with before and after school programs, even before the child was in school. Nightbitch knew this because the videographer had said as much in passing with a laugh. The videographer had no regrets, which she actually said after her third glass of wine. No regrets, with a laugh and a clink of her wine glass against Nightbitch's. No ambivalence, a strong and clear vision of herself in the studio and her child elsewhere, wherever that may have been. So these other women, these successful women, of course they discussed their many successes, swapping the names of gallery curators and art world agents with heightening excitement, screeching with joy as one announced a new show, the other a new grant, both of them comparing their residency schedules and teaching gigs for the coming year. I simply have too many opportunities being offered to me, the working mother said. I'm going to have to let go of the ones that bore me, honestly. There's just not enough time in the day. Nightbitch nodded, hoping that it appeared as though she completely understood. Not enough time for all those creative pursuits. Totally, indeed. Nightbitch had ordered a kale salad topped with a lovely piece of salmon, and the longer she ate, the more kale seemed to appear on her plate. She assiduously shoveled it into her smiling mouth, chewing and chewing and chewing. As the women talked, actually turned their chairs toward each other on the other side of the circular table and talked and talked and talked, Nightbitch chewed. I am a cow, she meditated. I am a Zen cow in a soothing green field. This meditation she needed to counteract the cud that rose from down in her guts, for it was there she discovered with a startling pang of nausea. She had pushed all the anger and sadness, all the disappointment about how her life had turned out. It was there she had buried the talented and plucky young woman with big ideas and an unusual point of view. That young woman was down in her intestines, biding her time, or perhaps dead, suffocated in all the shit. And up where Nightbitch still lived, up and out in the air and at the table in the lamplit restaurant, tucked into a charming bricked strip of buildings in a quaint little college town, there sat a middle-aged mom, out of the art world for a significant amount of time, no longer a newcomer, but also not yet emerged, not yet even introduced to the art world, really, save for some very minor regional shows, a few articles here and there, but otherwise decidedly unemergent, with no hopes of surfacing soon. And this was not how Nightbitch had viewed herself, not by a long shot, for she had been keeping this idea alive, that there was infinite time and potential and opportunity, that she wasn't that old, that her life wasn't over. But sitting at that table, she saw quite starkly, through 2 glasses of white wine and an entire bale of kale, that she was none of these things and instead was, in a word, insignificant. She saw herself as these other women now saw her, a silent, sad woman sipping wine without so much as a single exciting comment or opinion to offer to the conversation. She was so uninteresting that they didn't even need to acknowledge her for a good half hour. It wasn't mean. It was just that she didn't figure into their conversation. Surely it wasn't mean. She was talented, and she would have been as successful as they were had she kept working. She assumed they had all understood this, had this as a shared understanding that put them all on an even playing field. Honestly, none of this had even been consciously considered until this very moment, when she was forced to see herself in this pathetic context, in this pathetic way. At first, she thought she might cry, but then she saw she would do something far worse. All of the rage and hopelessness of those long months before Nightbitch emerged, tidal waved back into her. Surely her friends had not meant a thing by all this, had meant no insult, had not even really been thinking of her at all, to be honest. But it was this lack of consideration that wounded her the most, that she could no longer even be a part of their conversation. Not that she wanted to be part of such self-involved banter, but she would have liked to be invited to join and then reject it. She deserved that at the very least. She returned to those horrible thoughts of her husband sipping coffee in a quiet shop while leisurely perusing a periodical, to her long days of trains and failed naps and encouraged poops in the potty and train tracks and more trains. She swelled with self-indulgent anger, for indeed she saw she was on the verge of throwing a temper tantrum. Much in the same way, her son tossed himself to the living room floor, kicking and clawing, injuring himself in the process, and then crying even harder. And she would not stop herself. It was either blasting the anger out or turning the anger in, and she wasn't willing to keep it there any longer. She would not shred herself up inside, would not churn her guts to acid, would not grind her teeth in her sleep or cause her neck to go out for the sake of being civil and mature and understanding and level-headed. And it was just as the videographer was making a joke saying, look, I realize I joke about being a narcissist, but I think I actually am a narcissist. That Nightbitch rose all at once from her chair, tipping the table and sending the silverware clattering to the floor, a glass onto its side, and the water therein onto the lap of the working mother, whose eyes widened and mouth formed a silent O. With a great roar, which halted chatter in the restaurant and plunged it into an eerie, stunned silence. There she stood, panting, so winded already was she from her rage. She growled at the women, then barked and barked and barked, closing her eyes and forcing the animal sounds from herself, her ab muscles contracting violently, her pelvic floor heaving from years of diligent Kegel exercises. I could crush a walnut with my vagina, she yelled, and no one in particular. And it was then that the people around her came into sharp focus. Her friends, the artists, seated across from her at the table, one of them shielding her eyes as if she were looking directly at the sun, the other with a slight smile creeping across her lips. An old man at the booth behind them, mouth agape, a small girl in the next booth cowering into her mother's ribs, and her mother stroking her hair and shushing her, whispering comforting things as she glared at Nightbitch. Mortified, Nightbitch began to sweat profusely, descended into an open-mouthed pant, and had the fleeting thought that perhaps she was now in the throes of an early menopause. Then, despite her best attempts, she began to cry, hot, angry tears as she collected her bag and her coat. The working mother tried to say something in a soothing, low tone. Nightbitch held up a hand. Don't, she said, then monstered out of the restaurant in a lumbering walk, more tornado than human bipedal propulsion. She surged toward the door and disturbed everything in her wake, blowing napkins off tables and overturning cups and tripping and stumbling and snorting. It was her goal to get out of the place before the transformation really took hold, but she could not resist the smell of red meat after what seemed a lifetime spent chewing kale. She stopped at a two-seater high top by the door, a young couple, the woman with a sparkling ring on her left hand, bright with love. The young woman leaned back and stifled a scream as Nightbitch grabbed her half-eaten burger from her plate, ripped a bite from it, then dropped the bun, the lettuce, and onion and tomato to the floor as she exited the dining area. She shoved the meat patty into her maw and chewed and salivated as she surged away down the street. She loped through a puddle-strewn alleyway and once out of downtown, crashed through shrubs, wanting not to be seen, to stay in the shadows where she could pant and snort and sob. She pointed herself toward the nature preserve, toward the dark and comforting woods tucked right into the middle of town, to cry and snarl in the darkness beneath the trees. To cry and muck about in the tendril of stream that flowed toward her neighborhood. She stood there, letting the icy water numb her sore, bleeding feet. She had lost her sandals somewhere along the way, and the water felt so good she let out a little guttural howl. Snot dripped from her nose to intermingle with hot, dirty tears. She careened in the stream, pushing over fallen logs and pulling shrubs from the banks as she searched for something to steady her. It was her goal to make havoc, to leave a mess, to wrest from her form all of the rage and sadness and insanity of these years since her son was born. She had been storing it all in the puckered dough of her thighs, the sad little paunch hanging around her middle, and the dark brown circles she could not seem to get rid of that framed her eyes day and night, and the joints of her fingers, which had now begun to hurt whenever she was tired or angry or sad, which was always. And I think I'll pause there. Thanks.
Thank you. That was fantastic.
Great. So Elizabeth, do you want to start with the question? Because I know you were thinking about this particular section of the book.
I mean, I had one question in particular, and then I wrote down three more while you were talking, Rachel. But I do want to go back to this first one, which is the husband, and which is further than that. It's sort of, one of the things that Pam and I have talked about over the years is, when can we call this a class about parenthood? When is that going to happen? When are things going to change enough so that not so much is down to the mother? And one of the things I loved about what you read, it is a brilliant representation of that. And the character of the husband, that one part where she's thinking about her husband somewhere in a cafe, sipping coffee and reading a periodical. So that's part of her anger as well. So can you talk a little bit about that? I know that he's not going to wind up being the husband that we so often see in some books about motherhood. But this idea of the woman completely alone and completely responsible for every day-to-day need of a child. Does that sound like a question?
I mean, I can certainly talk about that. Yeah, about motherhood versus parenthood and fatherhood. I certainly didn't want the father in the book just to be a villain and just to be, I don't know, like another dad who doesn't and won't get it, like refuses to kind of participate in what's going on at home. I think, there is, it's complicated, right? Because I do think even when I've taught, I had I went to a book club recently and there was a lesbian couple there and they each had a child in their marriage. And they said they both related with the dad and they both related with the mom. Because when they weren't the biological parent of the child, they did kind of fall into that. They felt like they didn't know what to do, when their wife had the baby, like they felt like, how do I plug into this intense biological bond that these two people have? And I think there's something there, right? There's something true there that, like, as the mother, as the biological parent of the child, there is this very intense physical bond that you can have with your offspring. And really, like, that's kind of the whole world for a while. That's like all there is. And I don't think that we've been acculturated to think, oh, well, fathers or partners are also a really essential part of that first year or those first years or those early days, right? We think, oh, it's the mother's baby. And so for me, when I was kind of in that phase, I was thinking a lot because I wasn't writing, and I was thinking, why haven't we been acculturated to think that men, that like that our husbands do play an essential role? And like, I just felt like it was up to me to not only, keep this beautiful little baby alive, but I also had this huge job of sort of teaching my husband how to be a dad, which I didn't feel was fair, like teaching him what to do and how to support me. When that wasn't even like kind of a question in his mind. He's like, well, I'll just go back to work, because that's what happened. That's what we do that's what the norm. We all just go back to work and it's fine. And we handle it. And it just, for whatever reason, didn't seem that simple to me, when I had my child. And so it just led me to start thinking, is it really that simple for people? Is it really as simple as it's sort of presented to mothers? And I felt really alone. I felt like I was the only one who wasn't able to do it. And I was really failing because I couldn't work a really big full-time job running a nonprofit and have my husband out of town and have a baby. Like, what was wrong with me? Yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does, because I think in some ways what we're trying to do in this class is imagine something else.
Mhm.
And I think what you're saying is many of us have internalized this idea. We're the one who knows where the socks are. We're the one who knows best friend's name. we're the ones who know when the birthday party is. But I think, for our students, that part of what they're asking and wondering is sort of what you're saying. We kind of wondered about, is this going to change and how do we change it? And we need to change it. So I
Yes.
think you did it beautifully. Thank you.
And to add to that, if I may add one more thing, something I've been saying as I talk about this book is that I think, women in particular are taught to sort of be overachievers and overperformers. And it really occurred to me how, both in this book and in my own life, how underachieving can be a radical act of feminism and incredibly empowering to say, no, I don't want to know how to do that thing. I don't want to learn another thing. I'm not
Exactly.
interested in being in charge of anything more. I don't want to take notes for this meeting.
Yes.
And I think that's part of my work of deprogramming myself, right? To be a constant provider and a constant achiever, and to make everyone around me feel comfortable to my own discomfort, and to my own exhaustion.
No,
I love that. Yeah, I love that. But speaking of something else, I wanted to ask about, so your unnamed narrator, and we could also maybe talk about that, why she's not named. She discovers fairly early on in the narrative a book, and she becomes obsessed with a book called A Field Guide to Magical Women, authored by one Wanda White. And when she tries to do research on Wanda White, she can't find anything, but she has this book, right? And so I wanted to read just like from page 40, where she's talking about, and it's kind of, she calls it a kind of mythical ethnography. And in the foreword, Wanda White explained that she was interested in the ways in which womanhood manifests on a mythical level, and was particularly drawn to the experience of motherhood and how this complicates, deepens, or denies womanhood. And then went on to ask, to what identities do women turn when those available to them fail? How do women expand their identities to encompass all parts of their beings? How might women turn to the natural world to express their deepest longing and most primal fantasies? And then at the end of the, so she appears, and this book appears at certain crucial moments for the narrator. And then at the end of the novel, I think this is on page 231, but she says, and this is the narrator talking to herself, Wanda White is not a person. Wanda White is a place at which a person finally arrives. So Rachel, I was wondering if you could talk about how you envisioned this book, that it's kind of a Bible for her, right? It keeps her going. And I just wanted to know sort of the backdrop about that, but also thinking that really the novel that you wrote is kind of a creative version, right, of Wanda White's book.
Yeah, absolutely. The mother is so isolated that I needed a way, just on a sort of craft level, I needed a way for her to be able to be in conversation with someone. And she seems to be quite, thoughtful, quite intellectual. And so it seemed natural for her to turn to a book. I love books within books. It's one of my favorite tropes. So, and really it was also a way for the book to sort of ask itself questions as I wrote it. That passage you read on page 40 is sort of questions that are pointing the book that I'm writing in a certain direction. Like I don't know the answers to those, but I think the book is beginning to articulate it's what it's exploring there.
Right, like what are the questions that she needs to ask, that she has permission for herself to ask?
Yes. And I think, also as I was writing, I had a lot of thought about who Wanda White was, just sort of like plot wise, to figure it out for myself. Like, and I definitely wrote some stuff that didn't wind up in the book, like more kind of backstory. It was a little bit more plotty, right? Like, oh, and then we find out who she is and da da da. And that didn't really seem to fit. And so I was like, okay, so she's not going to be sort of like a fully realized character. She's going to be more of a mystery. And for a time, I also thought, well, maybe she's just a performance artist, and this book is a performance piece. And again, like I liked thinking of her in that way, but then I thought, well, I don't need to put that in the book either. And then at the end, so I kept having this question of like, who or what is Wanda White, was something I was writing with that question. So then when I arrived at the end and kind of tried to answer it, it seemed provocative to me to say she's a place, right? She's like this state or place at which we arrive, this place of wisdom, both wisdom and mystery, right? Of asking these kind of unanswerable questions. But she's a place like where seekers wind up. And that seemed right, that she should remain a mystery, and that I could kind of talk about her in different terms. Because again, I think, to what identities do women turn when those available to them fail? It's like, to what language do we turn when language fails us? To what ways of thinking about things do we turn when the normal ways of thinking about things fail us? So I think that's kind of like what I was trying to point to with where we wound up with Wanda White.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was thinking of her once I reread that part, that statement about her being a place. I was thinking, or is it more like, yeah, like a condition of possibilities, right? Like that you could just, there's a space for imagining these alternatives, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I have to say that for me, and I get this idea that she's a space, but it's like I have to have pictures in my head. And just to say, I always saw her as Margaret Mead, who I think of as a wise woman who knows a great deal about family and what children babysit. So I had her in my head as that. I love the way you described it.
So we should probably turn to the Q&A now. So we have, it looks like at least 5 questions from our viewers, our audience. So Patty, can you start?
Sure. The first
Thank you.
question from Mark. He says, maybe this question shouldn't be raised shortly after the Easter Bunny weekend, but would you care to comment on the bunny scene?
I mean, which bunny scene? I kind of am like, which bunny scene? Do you know what he is referring to? I mean, I feel like she kills multiple bunnies in the book. Maybe he's referring to the cat scene.
Eating the heads off of bunnies, and that must be what he's right. I mean, the killing of little animals, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't have too much to say about that. I think there was something provocative to me in being able to write not only a female character, but a mother character who does have an element of violence, because it is so taboo. And having like that violence kind of, I mean, it's outside of the home, right? It's not in a domestic space until it is in a certain way. But to me, that felt like really real with her rage, that there was this kind of edge that was really dangerous. And so I think that's kind of like where the killing of small animals comes in. And I'm sure there are other readings of it too, in terms of wildness and feralness.
Thank you. Another question from Molly, who's curious to hear more about your thoughts about how the experience of new motherhood which is so different from mothering older children, intersects with class identity and awareness, and how that might fuel the rage that takes hold of Nightbitch.
How the experience of new motherhood intersects with class identity. Yeah, I mean, I do think that the feelings that Nightbitch has can and do kind of run across all classes. Like I do think that these sort of gendered roles we can take on in parenting are there kind of regardless of where you sit in the class paradigm. I do think though, obviously, the problem of childcare is a real problem, and it's a mental health issue. It's like a maternal health issue, and I don't think it's just this luxury that I don't think it should be viewed as a luxury. I think it should be viewed as something that's essential to the well-being of women and mothers. And I think that's played out in this book, right? That for this mother to be well, she cannot simply be a mother 24/7. And I think for any parent to be well, they cannot be a parent 24/7. And that there is this essential component of time for oneself, of self-care. And I hesitate to say self-care because it's been so like commodified, and but like real self-care and real kind of like communion with like your creative space, with your soul space. And that happens very pragmatically through having access to childcare, and having to access, to money for childcare. I mean, I started writing this book because I got a grant from the state of Iowa for $10,000, and I found incredibly affordable childcare, and that's why this book exists. And it wouldn't otherwise. Yeah.
And just to piggyback on that, I mean, it seems like the multi-marketing subplot within the book and the women that she
Yes.
right initially spurns and and is horrified almost by, right, but that there are these, right, that these schemes, right, are peddled to to people like stay-at-home women, right, to say, oh, you can make money doing this, right?
Yes, and that your self-worth is going to come through participating in capitalism and through like economics, right? Like that's where you're actually going to finally be happy, is by like becoming a part of this scheme. And it just struck me as so counterfeit and so wrong-headed. I mean, yes, absolutely, like people need money and that's great, but these schemes are not money makers for most people. They're money takers and they're time takers. And it just all struck me like the whole the language of multi-level marketing and that whole world strikes me as so counterfeit and hollow. So that was something I was exploring through that subplot.
And I would just like to say one thing about one of the things I love most about the book, and I'm glad you read the dinner time scene and the way she saw her artist friends, and you could see her rage and her loneliness, but how ridiculous they were in their art. But this group of women in the book, which she initially talks about in very sort of mocking kinds of ways, she then discovers that she needs women friends, and she begins to look at them in a way that isn't mocking, where she really sees them as human beings. And I'm just so glad you included that, because I think our character is so alone, and to find other women was a huge step forward for her and allowed her to do her art with some support and with some love. So I did love that part.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I did want to kind of dramatize how, you know, being competitive with other women is not the answer, nor is being disdainful, right? That it's actually a matter of figuring out how to be in community with other mothers and other women. That's so essential, um, again, to like maternal happiness and to feeling like
Yes.
you can raise a child. Yeah.
And I'd say thank you for that, including that.
Okay, thank you. The next question, I guess I'll go to this question because it's kind of along those lines. Another thank you from Ellen, who says, I've never had an experience reading like I did in Nightbitch. Never needed to see parts of my experience reflected in black and white the way I did. I had horrific PPD, PPA. Can you explain about your early postpartum days?
Oh, Ellen, thank you so much for those kind words. They make me feel so happy and fulfilled. Um, I think it was only in writing this book that came to terms with the fact that I was probably going through something very diagnosable in early motherhood. And I mean, I think it says something that I didn't even really kind of catch it or notice it. And then, like I never thought to like go to the doctor or to get support. I thought, oh, I just needed to like figure it out. Once again, I'm not being a good mom and I need to figure it out. I need to get out of bed. I need, yeah. So I've just heard from again, I thought that I was special in my experience of early motherhood. I thought I was very alone. And I have heard from literally hundreds of women who had very similar experiences to Nightbitch, right? Where the experience of being in charge, keeping a baby alive, being there for that person 24/7, physically, mentally, psychically, is just absolutely debilitating in a lot of ways if you don't have support. And so I've just been struck and sort of, I don't want to say horrified, but I am sort of like mouth agape at all of the women who are like, this is my story. Like, this is also how I felt in early motherhood, which has just, only reinforced to me that how much we need like different and better stories in our culture, like different and better stories of motherhood and of parenthood, of fatherhood. We need different and better stories of fatherhood. And so hopefully this is, I feel, I'm so happy that people feel seen, because I think so many mothers do not feel seen in their own household, and they do not feel understood. And that is a really like lonely and damaging experience. And so to be able to say, no, like what you are going through, I acknowledge that. And it's not just in your head, like it is really, really hard. I'm glad that the book could do that for readers.
Thank you, Rachel. Maybe we can end with this question. Someone asked, what was your biggest surprise in the process of you writing this book?
What's the biggest surprise? Oh, I think the biggest surprise was when I got closer to the end, and Nightbitch she turns toward her parents again and starts thinking about her parents, with whom she's been somewhat estranged, right? Her parents, they're rendered as perhaps Mennonite, perhaps, of a different kind of like era. She can't really relate with them. We can't really relate with her. But in the end of the book, she is able to sort of reframe her relationship with them, and especially with her mother, and to think about them with kind of like love and connection rather than estrangement and alienation. Like something in her shifts, right? As she becomes more like less estranged from herself. She's able to like see her parents as people, and to kind of like lovingly incorporate them into her story. And that was a surprise to me, and just a really wonderful gift of the writing experience.
So I know in the interview that we did with you online last October, we had asked about, inserting, knowing that there was or I knew that there was a connection there, right, and, to your own life there with your mother. And you had said something like, oh, I almost didn't include that at all, right? But it seems like now you've basically explained why that is.
Yes, and yeah, there's a whole backstory which I almost took out. Like, why do we need that? But I think it does add this, nice layer of who this character is as an individual. And I should also say I was really nervous to have my own mom read this. She's, she's Mennonite. She's been married for 50 years. And I had this really magical call with her where I was like, what did you think? And she said, I totally understand. I totally get it.
What a great thing.
And that was an incredibly profound moment. Yeah. So this book has, it's so many gifts.
Yeah. So maybe we should end on that note, right? That's really wonderful. I'm so pleased to hear that. Thank you so much, everyone who has attended and who has asked questions. And please go buy Rachel's book or get it from the library, however you want to get it. But it's really worth your time. Yes.
And Rachel, thank you so much. I think the section that you read was just perfect, and we really appreciate the ways in which you answered our questions as well. So thank you. And I think we're going to see you in class tomorrow for a period of time. We will let you know what time and how to get in there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Yeah,
Thank
it was
2:45, I think. Just plan your
Right.
day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Patty. Thank
Thanks,
you, Lily.
Patty.
Yeah.